this. One of the things that motivated me to do that research was the realization that the institutionally normative structures of school were probably holding our kids back. And the other thing I realized was all these years we've been doing professional development where we're trying to change the teacher so the teacher can change the experience for the kids. The problem I realized was that the kids are the biggest stakeholders in this. And early efforts I was doing in professional development to try to change these norms was always through the teacher. And all of the results were sort of indicating, yeah, well, if the teacher's already doing problem solving, then this works. And if they're not, then it doesn't work. And the kids had a lot more to say about what was going to work in the classroom than what the teacher was doing. So part of this research was informed by trying to change the norms, and the other part through the realization that we really got to create a new norm for the kids early on. And this is where the vertical surfaces and the random groups and the rich tasks came in. That first wheel has those three things, and they come very powerfully together. And what they do is it creates a radically different normal for the kids so that the kids can be different. And that kind of creates momentum. So yeah, the teacher has to do things different. What it does is it changes the kids. And it changes the kids and their experience in the room so quickly and so radically that now the teacher can start to do the work of changing their practice. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely it does. And, it's interesting to me because even just highlighting, the vertical non-permanent surfaces, visible random grouping, and then the idea of problem solving. I know some of these pieces are in these 14 recommendations that you have. I'm wondering, can you help for someone who's listening going like, what is a vertical non-permanent surface? I mean, really, if we think about what each word means, I think people would be able to figure it out, but it just sounds kind of scary. Like, what does that mean to you? And maybe, I don't know, is there a specific reason why you use that language over maybe something else?
So first of all, I should say that the first time I ever experienced that myself was as a teacher when my department head started dabbling with this. And then I did it, and then I left it, and then I didn't come back to it until I was doing this research. It's called a vertical non-permanent surface. That's not what it was called to begin with. What it was called to begin with was a whiteboard. And not just any whiteboard. The research showed clearly that when we have the kids working in groups at whiteboards that are mounted on the wall, not little individual whiteboards or even bigger whiteboards at the table, we saw way more engagement across a whole bunch of different metrics, from eagerness to start to participation to perseverance. Like the metrics were through the roof whenever we had the kids working in groups at vertical whiteboards. But teachers are incredibly innovative. When they started to find that this was really effective, but they were limited in resources, they started to improvise. And we learned that it worked just as well if we worked on windows, or if we duct taped up a shower curtain, or stapled a vinyl picnic table cover onto our bulletin board, or if we stood our tables up on end, or if we wrote on the side of a file cabinet.
Now, is there a difference between a blackboard? Like, was there anything there? I've always made the assumption in my mind, maybe it's just an assumption, or maybe I've heard something a couple of years ago when I've seen you speak a few times. Is there anything about a blackboard with chalk? Is there pro con to that, or would that just kind of fit into this other grouping that you've highlighted here?
It fits in perfect. The only difference is that when we have the kids working on whiteboard or whatever surface, we only give them one marker. And likewise, they only get one piece of chalk. Well, they can break the chalk. So we have to make a whole bunch of noise around that so that they stay with one writing implement. It forces a collaboration and the communication better.
Yeah, so you'd have to have those norms very, now I don't want to say structured, it sounds wrong, but just making sure that the community is strong enough where students don't feel the need to sort of like try to get around that idea, right?
Right. So like every time you break the chalk, the Leafs lose a game or something like that. Right? Like
a couple of years ago, we didn't have to do anything and the Leafs were losing, but now it's not so bad.
There's a lot of chalk being broken back then. So this notion of vertical non-permanent surfaces as a word or as a phrase replaced the notion of whiteboards because in order to honor the ingenuity of the teachers I was working with.
I know you said that just because it's vertical and non-permanent, like what are your ideas on like why that data is the way it is?
I love those why questions. One of the things that was amazing about this research was in every instance, I had the results before I had the explanation. And this was one of them. Vertical non-permanent surfaces came out number one in every metric. I had no idea why. So now came the fun part, right? Like trying to unpack this and make sense of it. So it turns out that there's a whole bunch of reasons why it's better. So one, ergonomically, it turns out that having your head in a up position is better for you than having it tilted down. That's a very subtle thing. It turns out that blood flow that's promoted by having to stand is good for you. Also very subtle. It turns out that 50% of communication is nonverbal, right? So it's done through gestures. And it turns out it's easier to gesture when we're standing than when we're sitting. It also very subtle. Some other subtle things. When we're standing, every student in the group has the same orientation to the work and the ability to look at other people's work. That's not so subtle. That's a really powerful stimulus for the students who are working in this setting.
That's interesting. When I'm on the phone, even, I'm like a pacer. If I'm brainstorming, I tend to want to stand. So, some of the pieces that you've just articulated there, just this idea of, ergonomically, also like the blood flow kind of, I always felt it was like the adrenaline, right? But I mean, that's, your blood kind of doing its thing, right? Sending things where it needs to go. So that makes a ton of sense to me, for sure.
But all of those things were trumped by one other piece of research that emerged later on in the process. And it took a long time to get at this because the kids had a difficult time articulating. But it turns out it's not that standing is so good, it's that sitting is so bad. And not like sitting is the new smoking bad, but like it turns out when the kids are sitting, they feel anonymous. And when they feel anonymous, they are much more likely to disengage. And that's both a conscious and a subconscious act. So, the teacher can't see me, so I'm going to work on my social studies homework. Or that sort of subconscious pulling out the phone and looking at it. Or just subconsciously disengaging. And like I said, it took a while to get at this, but when they are sitting, they feel anonymous. And the further they are from the teacher, the more anonymous they feel. And the more things that are between the teacher and that student, like desks and other students, the more anonymous they feel. And all of a sudden we have them standing, spread out around the room, they don't feel anonymous anymore.
It's almost like they have to have their A game out.
Yeah. But what's interesting is they don't feel like they're being put on display or that it's not a conscious feeling. It's just that subconscious feeling of being able to disengage because you're anonymous isn't there anymore.